A bit different. Jerome Foster II, thank you so much for coming and being with us here today. Jerome is a 16-year-old climate activist. He began following Greta Thunberg's beginning weekly climate strikes in Sweden, and also Alexandria Villaseñor having weekly climate strikes outside of the UN in New York. Jerome has also begun his own weekly climate strike outside of the White House. Jerome, I think that we as adults in the room all very much share your objectives for climate justice, but sometimes I think that we're not quite as good as disrupting and changing the conversation as young people like you. So we just very much like to learn from your experiences and hear about some of the ways that you've been making governments listen.
So thank you for inviting me to speak here today and giving me young people the platform to talk about these issues. And I say that when we talk about like the climate strikes and their fight for climate justice, I feel like we kind of get mischaracterized in saying that a lot of people don't understand what climate justice is. Is that when you're trying to advocate for environmental change, because when we talk about justice, we can't have climate justice in an unjust system that's inherently unjust. Because when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about trying to reverse colonialism. We're trying to talk about reversing racism, which has exploited entire communities and exploited entire people. And we're trying to create a system that's focused on development and an economic system that's focused on growth. And we have to act. I give the analogy of a tree. A tree at some point decides to say, I've grown enough, I have enough branches, I have enough roots, and I'm going to develop and make sure that my tree that I've now built and grown is now nourished in all parts. So that what we have to do is to not just say that we need climate justice and have development in certain parts of the world and say that, oh, we're doing this for charity, but to see humanity as one species and one people. To say that we have an accountability to make sure that every place in the world is equitable and making sure that we aren't looking to people, other countries, and saying we're going to give you this handout. It's not a handout, but it's our responsibility to make sure that countries have the quality of life that they need. And when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about having people at the table, not just at talks like this, but at the negotiation table. It's places like the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which their communities are not being represented in the conference parties. It is having their voices at the table, which will provide climate justice. Because when we currently invite people to speak at these conferences, we say that, oh, we're trying to get their voice, but we need to not just listen to them, but also make sure that we're actually using this as a way to implement. Because when we look at indigenous people, they have lived in harmony with nature for thousands of years, and that is something that we need to go back to. Right now, humanity is at odds with nature and at odds with the natural cycles, and we're destroying the natural cycles. So if we work with indigenous people that have lived in harmony with those natural cycles, we'll learn to go back to that system. And that's what we're talking about climate justice. Because indigenous people make up 6% of the human population, but they make up 90% of cultural diversity. They have an immense diverse culture that they can bring to humanity today, but we're not listening to them. It is places that are in Brazil. Those communities that are being destroyed because we've placed value on the woods. What we call the forest and what we call Brazil is we just see it as an exploitable resource that is not valuable at all. But we have to make sure that we are inherently valuing those natural resources and in valuing them in a way that is meaningful and not just saying we value these trees, they're priceless. But we have to actually give those nations the actual amount of accountability and say that you have these trees that actually saves humanity. What is more valuable, a car that's new that's in 2019 or the forests that help us breathe and help us stay alive? We have to be able to make sure those systems are accountable to saying that these are actually more valuable, so we must actually have our economic systems seen that way. And we can't just have that from a moral and social perspective, but an economic perspective and a socio-economic perspective to make sure that we aren't just saying that, oh, we can exploit these resources, we can exploit water limitlessly because water is cheap. Trees are cheap. We can cut them down and we'll rebuild them later on, but we never rebuild them. We just graze them and use them and exploit them. We have to make sure that we're valuing these systems. And that's what the climate strikes movement is about, is that saying that young people that are here, we were born into this crisis. And when we're born into this crisis, we're saying that we had no ability to be able to influence politics. And we are saying that we're that we don't have the right to, we don't have the ability to vote yet because we're not 18. In other countries, some people don't even have the ability to vote at all. So we're saying that what we need to do is we're gonna build a movement, because there's three pillars of power in the world. There's economics, there's government, and then there's people. And we're saying that we're going to use the power of the people to change politics. Because in democracy, it is the power of the people that changes their democracy to make sure that they're actually making sure that they're valuing the people's perspective. And we're saying that the climate strikes is showing that young people need change, and that we cannot grow up in a system that continues to exploit people and continue to exploit resources and promote ecological disaster. We're saying that we are having a call to action, saying that this is a climate emergency, and saying that the climate strikes is saying that young people will strike all around the world to say that this is the most pressing issue that we must solve in the next 11 years before the Earth reinforces those same cycles and we cannot stop it. By the year 2030, and I would say that in the year 2030, I won't even live to the ages that some of you have enjoyed to live. And I feel like we won't have the same type of clean air, clean water, and livable future that we so dreamed of, and saying that, oh, we're going to run for president, but you have to be 35 to run for president. That will be in 2040, 10 years after we reach the tipping point. So when we talk about, whenever I go to meet people, they say, "Oh, you're going to run for president." But first, we have to believe in the people that are already in politics. And when I go to meet politicians, they say, "Oh, I meet with them. I'm saying, what are you going to do to solve the climate crisis?" And they just say like, "Oh, it's so amazing. You're going to be our future. You're going to save politics." And I say, "No, I'm coming here to meet you to say, how are you going to solve it? I don't have the power. I'm coming to you to say that you have to use your power to actually make sure that we're equitable in serving humanity in the best way possible." And that's what the climate strike movement is. And I would like to just say that, like, young people all around the world look to the United Nations as a place that makes decisions worldwide. But we also must be aware and be cognizant of how politics right now, in that in democratic systems, the power doesn't come from the top; it comes from the bottom. So that is what we need to be focusing on as well, and not just from the top levels of society, but also from the bottom level, so we can reach this middle ground and say that in the Kyoto Protocols in 1992, the United States and many other nations came together and said, we're going to have sustainable development goals. But when they came back to the United States, they weren't able to implement it. Yet they signed the agreement. They never implemented the restrictions to emissions. So the problem is that they just backed out and said, "Oh, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to be in the Kyoto Protocol." And the problem was that they didn't have public support. And that's what's happening in democratic societies now, is that we're building a movement to make sure that people are aware of climate disaster and are aware of the emergency that humanity is in now, and saying that we need, for the Paris and climate agreements and for future agreements, that we need to be actively involved as human beings, not just governments to say, we're going to look to you to solve our problems. We're going to say we're going to work as a collective human species to solve this problem. Every single person working together. And the biggest problem is that currently corporations are saying that, oh, you need to clean up your trash, you need to recycle. But the problem is that we can't rely on people to be 100% conscious of what they're recycling. We need to look to those corporations and say, why are you creating these plastics? Why are you even giving us these resources and putting the blame on us when you created these? And that's what we need to be focusing on, is that corporations deliberately did that in an ad campaign to say that you need to clean up the trash that we're giving you. But we're going to say that these corporations need to be accountable for their exploitation of our world. And us young people don't have an agenda. We just want a livable future. And that's what we're fighting to protect.
Thank you so much, Jerome. I'm sure